Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and I've got 6 more cards to review here in part 9, including Captain Hooktusk, the legendary troll champion for Rogue. If you don't have time, hit the quick reviews link in the description. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into the detailed reviews. Up first, let's talk about Captain Hooktusk, the legendary troll champion for Rogue. 8 mana, 6/3 pirate, and she has a battle cry that reads, summon 3 pirates from your deck, give them rush. So clearly Captain Hooktusk can give you a lot of instant minions, and those minions get to attack really quickly too, thanks to rush. And, you know, with pirates, that may not sound that exciting, as we've typically understood pirates to be, you know, really aggressive, fast minions, even thinking of them with charged with South Sea deckhands. But with cards like Ticket Scalper, we saw revealed earlier in the expansion, that draws you 2 cards with Overkill when it's able to attack, a card a lot of people said was too slow. Now with Captain Hooktusk, suddenly Ticket Scalper is an insanely crazy card to get, because you can instantly attack with it. It has a really strong attack value. It kills something and you draw 2 more cards. So Captain Hooktusk becomes this, you know, not only board bomb, but potentially, you know, resource bomb as well, if she gets the right pirates pulled out of the deck. We've seen in the past, anytime a card can just load up a board, it's generally a good thing. From all the way back to like Dr. Boom, right? You just get a big pile of stuff. Often that's strong, and Captain Hooktusk is pretty much always going to give you 4 minions if you build your deck to have enough pirates. And playing 4 minions on turn 8 is good. The question becomes, for a card like Captain Hooktusk, how well does she line up with the pirate archetype? Because clearly, you're gonna have to support pirates to make Captain Hooktusk work at all. And then again, as I teased earlier, most pirates are typically more early game oriented. There aren't that many late or mid game pirates that exist. And although certainly Rastakhan's Rumble has already teased a couple, and there might be even more, still just that play style might not support what Captain Hooktusk wants to do, because she's 8 mana. If she were like 4 or 5 mana and summoned a couple pirates, like yours truly designed her to be, I think she would fit much, much better into that mold, because I wonder if a pirate deck can stay alive and can compete. By the time turn 8 hits, it might be too late. Even if you get a great play with Captain Hooktusk and you're able for your pirates to swing the board, she herself is only at 3 health. A 6/3 just isn't that impactful either. It's just so easy to die. So if the pirates all trade in and Captain Hooktusk just kind of lingers around, you might not have all that swingy of a board anyway. And you might still be out of resources because you're running a pirate deck. So I do have some questions there about making it all fit together nicely with Captain Hooktusk. I'm having trouble envisioning what the deck that supports this card really looks like. How many pirates are there? How many other pieces are there? It's all just a little wonky right now. The puzzles don't quite seem to go together all that nicely. I will note that the spirit for Rogue is intriguing with Captain Hooktusk as well, because it doubles your battle cries, which means she could summon 6 pirates from your deck. That's even more impressive. And it's also worth noting that this, just because they have rush doesn't mean that they have to attack, right? Like, it might just be a board. They may not trade in, and that could be powerful. Things like South Sea Captains, in particular, buffing all your pirates can be insane if you get a couple of those. So there are clearly board states and game states where Captain Hooktusk is going to be big and impactful and probably rather good. It's just, are there decks where she's going to be big and impactful and rather good? I hope so. I think Blizzard, if not giving us the pirates necessary this time around, certainly might in the future. So fundamentally speaking, this card does something awesome and great. And clearly it's fast, and as far as it's, you know, giving them rush is good. The mana cost a little slow, but because it's so swingy, potentially I think that's not that big of a problem, generally speaking. Just as far as meta fit and deck fit right now, maybe some challenges, but Captain Hooktusk, still one of those cards you have to keep an eye on, because this could become very good, very fast if the support is there. Up next here, let's talk about Elemental Evocation from Mage, a 0 mana spell. The next elemental you play this turn costs 2 less. And, you know, this looks familiar to cards we've seen previously, things like Preparation, specifically for Rogue. Also has some Innervate vibes, where you're basically getting a couple mana for free. And generally in Hearthstone, cards that allow you to put out extra tempo, cards that manipulate your mana like that have been strong to the point where Innervate got nerfed, and I think Preparation might eventually get Hall of Famed. Those are really, really good cards. So those set a good precedent for something like this one. I do think, though, that Elemental Evocation, even though you can, cheat out lots of minions for a couple extra mana and smooth out your curve maybe for elemental activations on future turns, there are certainly ways to use this thing in a positive fashion. I do, despite all that, still think this card has some problems to overcome. And really, that just comes down to running through the elemental list for Mage and realizing that there's not a single card that just really blows my mind when you discount it with Elemental Evocation. In other words, like, playing a Water Elemental on turn 2 for 2 mana, like, yes, that's a very good play. It's just not like maybe game-winning or enormous enough perhaps to run something like Elemental Evocation. Because remember, this does take up a slot in your deck. It's a card you draw. It's a resource you're sacrificing. It's not another minion. It's not burst damage. It's its own thing. So you really have to get a lot out of it to make it worth that slot in your deck. And I think it's going to be hard to do that. I think it's going to be hard to cheat out a card fast enough to really make it matter. You can play even 2 of these, and in those cases, like, yes, sure, it gets more exciting. You can do some pretty crazy stuff playing 2 of these, getting out of, Water Elemental on the first turn of the game, right? Like, that's kind of nuts. That's better. But even then, like, you got to have both in your hand, and you are, like, out of resources when it happens, and Water Elemental's not winning you the game. There are cards like maybe Frozen Crusher, big 8/8s you can cheat out, but they have downsides themselves. So I just don't know. Now, that said, this is a card that will eventually and occasionally come off of, a random card generation, like your blast waves and stuff like that, which will be solid because there are just a lot of general elementals in Mage. It's particularly in a control deck. Maybe you get to cheat out your Arcanosaurs, turning them into real Duskbreakers at the cost of a card. Like, there are those instances where this is going to feel really good to play, and I think it's fine off of random card generation. I just don't think it's often going to make the cut in a constructed deck list. And yes, there are some like Archmage Antonitis shenanigans possible with 0 mana spells as well. So perhaps that's another thing to keep in mind. But again, just not maybe the most outstanding option comparatively. There's a lot you'd have to give up to run this. But all that said, I probably sounded more negative than I am. I do think it's a solid card just because tempo shenanigans are good in Hearthstone. Just not the absolute best card, but certainly a reasonable one nonetheless. Moving on, let's take a look at the Emberscale Drake, a 5-mana 5/5 dragon for Warrior. The battlecry reads, if you're holding a dragon, gain 5 armor. So this comes in the vein of that old card Shield Maiden. It was one of my favorite cards in Hearthstone. Emberscale Drake, a little cheaper, but it does have a conditional aspect to its armor gain battlecry. That said, I think we've seen a lot of cards for Dragon Warrior so far that will make it easy to achieve these sorts of battle cries. So for the use case of this card, 99% of the time in the Dragon decks that it's in, I'm going to assume that battle cry is pretty darn consistent. And that means you're getting a 5-mana 5/5 with 5 armor. And that's, that's not bad. Again, that's a pretty solid play. Good stats for the cost. Armor is important because you can do things like Shield Slam or Reckless Flurry with it. Unfortunately, this would always kill itself if you were going to set it up with Reckless Flurry, but with Shield Slam in particular, a nice little way to get some extra armor. It's an odd cost card, which means you could build like this odd Dragon Warrior of sorts, although you wouldn't have War Master Voon in that case, so maybe that's not the direction to go. Maybe it's more of a mid-range deck. That said, in a mid-range deck, armor is maybe not quite as valuable, so you probably got to go more of a control line to make a card like this feel very good. Cards like this are always great when they come off of generated effects, much like I talked about in our last card. So that's maybe the reason this exists. It will maybe to make the cut just in constructed decks to give you those dragon bodies to stay on curve and just sometimes keep things in your hand as well for other dragon activators. All around just looks like a solid piece of the puzzle for a dragon deck. So although, it's not as strong as cards we've seen in the past for dragons like Draconid Operative for Priest, right? This is clearly not on that level because armor's not quite as good as that resource generation. Still, a totally playable card in my mind, just not the most exciting one of the set. Up next, let's talk about the Bloodscalp Strategist for Hunter, 3-mana 2/4. Battlecry reads, if you have a weapon equipped, discover a spell. So here we have, you know, just an average stat line, not particularly exciting stat line at 2-4. 3-4s are much more common these days. The Hearthstone team has been much more willing to drop 3-4s onto things. I kind of wish Bloodscalp Strategist was a 3-4 as well. It would make it much, much better at trading. As it stands right now, this just kind of feels like a fodder body. It's not that great. It's okay. I mean, you might ask, why does one attack make that big of a difference? Well, there's just a lot of 3-3s in Hearthstone in that sort of mana range. So playing this on curve wouldn't often feel as good as playing a 3-4. That said, it's really about the battle cry here, probably, if you're trying to make this card an exciting thing. And that's because you get to generate a discovered spell. And, you know, getting to pick a spell to add to your hand can be helpful because Hunter has limited card draw resources, at least until recently when they've gotten some revealed. But still, a deck that, you know, likes having extra spells might be able to use Bloodscalp Strategist successfully. Now, there is a condition here. If you have a weapon equipped, that's going to be the requirement here to achieve the spell generation. But that's not that hard in Hunter. With things like Candle Shot, they're almost always just kind of lingering around. You kind of always have a weapon to play. There's also the Eaglehorn Boughs of the world. Now, Eaglehorn obviously comes down at the same cost as Bloodscalp Strategist, so that's a bit awkward. But if you played Strategist later in the game, just as, you know, flexible card to add into your turn 7 or something, clearly you could set it up to have a weapon available. You do have to wonder, though, if there are going to be instances where you, like, have to hold a weapon charge because you know you want to play your Bloodscalp Strategist next turn, and it creates kind of some friction there where you're needing to attack, but you also need the spell discovery. So even though I don't think it's hard to get this battle cry to go off, it is still kind of inconvenient. You don't really want to have to deal with it. And I'm not even sure Bloodscalp Strategist would be all that overpowered if it just said battle cry, discover a spell. Yeah, it would be, you know, probably power creep over cards like Gnomish Inventor, the 4-mana 2/4 that draws you a card. But is that so bad for a class card that desperately needs resource generation? Because the other problem for this card is that Hunter spells are a real mixed bag. You can get some pretty crazy stuff. Add extra kill commands to your deck for tons of damage. You could, you know, get another spell stone if you're running a secret deck. You could also just get, like, you know, arcane shots and just dinomancies and just cards that don't go that far. I guess arcane shot really wouldn't be that bad, but there's a lot of situational use case spells in Hunter that might be hard to use. So I think this has a pretty high chance of whiffing, or just not giving. Maybe you need damage, you don't find damage. Maybe you need value, you only find damage. There's just a lot of ways for this to go wrong and backfire. And because the stat line's a little off, because the condition is maybe not hard, but still just something to have to deal with, and because the discover a spell aspect is a bit awkward, all around, I'm rather light on Bloodscalp Strategist. I don't really think this card is going to do a lot of work. I think it's going to get left by the wayside. So not fundamentally terrible, just perhaps not quite there. Moving on, let's take a look at the big bad Voodoo spell for Shaman. It's 2 mana. It reads, give a friendly minion Death Rattle, summon a random minion that costs 1 more. So with this card here, you know, you put this on a 5-drop, and when that 5-drop dies, it turns into a 6-drop, or the 8-drop turns into a 9-drop, the 1-drop turns into a 2-drop, etc., which does give your minion or your board at least a little bit of resiliency, where it might be stickier and harder to deal with, which Shaman has great ways to utilize minions on board if they're sticking around. Also, you can just sometimes get, you know, a free 10-drop out of it if you put this on a 9-drop, and that's a 2-mana 10-drop is pretty exciting, right? Like, there's a lot of potential to use this thing for some big mana gains. You know, if you think about it, really, even using this on a 1-mana minion means you're going to get a free 2-drop, and that's a 2 mana for 2. That seems good. And then as you accelerate up the mana curve there, if you play it on a 6-drop, you're getting a lot of value return. A 9-drop, it's insane value return. So you can see why this card would look good, right? Like, that's in an ideal world where you get a good minion, big bad Voodoo, makes a lot of sense. And then there's also cards like Zentimo, which means you could actually cast this on 3 of your minions simultaneously. And then you have 3 minions coming back, make your board really sticky, and they get bigger too, probably a majority of the time. So all around, there are ways to make this guy work. But like many evolve type cards in the past, one of the issues is the randomness means you just don't know what you're going to get. So you're kind of investing mana, you're investing that resource of that card into an unknown variable. There are really bad 6-drops and 8-drops and all kinds of cards. I mean, maybe it's safe on 9-drop right now. There's still mostly a good 10 mana pool. But if you're playing this on 9 drops, have you already won the game? Like, you can't do that in a single turn. So, you know, this is a card that probably feels much better in the early to mid game when you're trying to stabilize a board state. Maybe not quite as much in the late game. It's also a little bit susceptible to silence, which, you know, all cards are that have good effects. It's not like a reason it's not good, but if you're investing in something and it gets silenced, that's a little sad. And then the other challenge I think for this card is that it is on a delay, so that if your opponent just doesn't kill your, so, you know, say you put this on a 5-drop, your opponent just doesn't kill the 5-drop for you, and you have to like trade in that minion the next turn. So you play this on turn 1, your opponent plays, they ignore your minion. On turn 2, you trade in your minion so that it dies and activates your big bad voodoo, right? You hit, that new minion hits the floor, and you give it back to your opponent, and then they can kill it if they want, but you might get to attack with it basically on the 3rd turn. So there's this big delay potentially between playing your big bad voodoo and getting a minion that can actually attack out of your big bad voodoo. And that's a problem, right? That big gap means there's a lot of times for this to fail or just be too slow to make an impact on the game. That's an issue. If you give it to taunt minions, of course, maybe you can force that action a little more. And we've seen that in the past with things like Ancestral Spirit, which brings me to another point. Is this better than Ancestral Spirit? Because with Ancestral Spirit, you know what minion you're getting back, right? If you put it on an Earth Elemental, you know you're getting an Earth Elemental back. That's how we've seen it used, and that makes a lot of sense, because that means you're getting a great minion instead of a random 6-drop. Random 6-drops are way worse than a 7-8 with taunt. And that's another issue for Big Bad Voodoo. It's just that randomness, right? With Evolve effects, you just don't know. Now, I do think this is an amazing flavor. The artwork's fantastic. It's a lot of fun with Zentimo. So I think the card maybe could just be played alongside Ancestral Spirit and some kind of deck that has awesome big stuff they're trying to do. But most of the time, I just don't see the deck that wants to run this card. It's just too inconsistent. It's a little awkward and slow to use. So I do think it will fall short. Now let's talk about the Sightless Ranger, a new 5-mana 3/4 neutral rush overkill minion. And when you overkill with a Sightless Ranger, you get 2 1/1 bats. So best case scenario with this card, right, is you trade into, you know, a 2/2 or something. It's got to be 2 health or less for the overkill to work. And then you get a couple 1/1 bats. That basically makes this a total of 5/6 in stats for 5 mana. Clearly that's not quite equivalent, but essentially 5/6 in stats, which is pretty good for 5. And then if it gets to attack a second time and overkill again, you get more bats, right? You're not limited to 1 round of bats, and that's pretty amazing. If you get 2 extra bats, you're feeling really good about this because you've generated 4 1/1s on top of it. That gives you 7/8 in total stats. That would be the perfect scenario for this card, and it would be pretty good. The issue there is achieving the perfect scenario. And even when you do, it's only pretty good. It's not amazing. Because most of the time for Sightless Ranger, it's going to be hard to achieve an overkill on turn 5. Your opponent's playing bigger stuff all the time, and the later in the game they get, the less likely they are to have small stuff. There are always token paladin decks out there, right? There are always 1/1s to hit, but it still becomes less consistent. By turn 5, there are going to be 5/5s out there, and suddenly it's a lot harder to kill those with overkill with Sightless Ranger. And if you don't get overkill, a 3/4 with rush for 5 is not very exciting. We've seen much better rush cards that just don't really even get played all that much as is. So Sightless Ranger has a big hill to climb as far as I'm concerned. And then even if you do get off that first overkill, getting a second overkill seems almost impossible because it just doesn't have enough health to linger around, and your opponent doesn't even have to play stuff to activate the overkill. And then ultimately as well, even when you get the overkill, 1/1 bats are just susceptible to other overkill minions from your opponent or blast waves or basically any whirlwind effect, right? So the reward for the overkill here doesn't seem that strong either. So what that means to me is Sightless Ranger, probably a good arena card just because it's active and instant and has some stats, but in constructed, I just don't think any deck has a reason to run this one. It looks like it's just going to fall pretty far short. So Sightless Ranger just coming in a little too weak to me. And there you go, folks. Those were the detailed reviews. Now let's jump into the quick reviews. Captain Hooktusk is a 4-star card. Elemental Evocation is a 3-star card. Emberscale Drake is a 3-star card. Bloodscalp Strategist is a 2-star card. Big Bad Voodoo is a 2-star card. Sightless Ranger is a 2-star card. All right, part 9 is done. Some cool cards here. I like the design direction for these. They're not all the strongest card in my mind, but still some fun stuff to play with, some cool archetype support. And that's what's making Rastakhan's Rumble so awesome so far. That said, if you guys have thoughts, comments, questions on these cards, of course, share those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.